In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 18, it says, so, everybody say so. So we fix our eyes, not on what is seen, but what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. This verse is saying that in every situation, in every circumstance, in every relationship, in every moment of our lives, there's two ways of looking at it. We can look at it from the earthly perspective. These are the visible, tangible, earthly things that are all around us every day. Or we can learn to see the unseen things of God. We can learn to see things in our lives from an eternal or godly perspective. And this verse is basically begging us to choose the latter, to choose to see things from the perspective of God. Because while these earthly things, in the earthly perspective, while they're easily seen, things like our relationships, or things like our talent, or our youth, or our good looks, these things, we can touch them, we can hold them, we can see them, and yet they are temporary. But then on the other side, the things of God, the eternal things of God, like His truth, and the way that He moves and speaks and acts and guides us in life, well, those things are not as easy to see, right? We can't hold them in our hands. We can't hear it audibly. We can't see it in front of us. While those things aren't as easy to see, those things, the things of God, are eternal. They will never pass away. They will never let us down. Essentially, this verse is calling all of us to learn to see the unseen things of God. Because if we can learn to see everything in our lives from a godly perspective, from our relationships to one another, to ourselves, to our circumstances, if we can learn to see the unseen things of God in every moment of life, then He will begin to move in our lives. He'll begin to speak to us, and we'll begin to recognize when He's doing so. Here's the problem with learning to see the unseen. It's unseen, so you can't see it. So how do we learn to see something that is unseen? By taking a different perspective. John chapter 9, I'm going to start in verse 1. In verse 1 it says, as Jesus passed by, He saw a man blind from birth. And His disciples said, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. I'm going to go on in verse 6. Having said these things, Jesus spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then He anointed the man's eyes with the mud, and He said to him, go and wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So the man went and washed, and he came back seeing. Here's the thing about learning to see, y'all. I want you to learn to see this week from that godly perspective. But before we learn to see, we have to discover what is blinding us. Yeah? You see, each and every person in this room, camper, counselor, alone, each and every one of us walked in here this week with something blinding us. Some worry about our future. Some brokenness in your family. Some issue in a relationship that you just can't keep off of your mind. There is something, if you really think about it, or several things in your life that are blinding you from seeing what God wants you to see this week, or hearing what God wants to say to you this week. You see, just like the man in the story, each and every one of us, we are blind in our own way. Now, I don't know how many of you out there have ever been healed of your blindness by wearing a mud mask, but I'm just saying it hasn't happened to me. But I imagine if it had, I would want to tell a few people about this, right? But that's what happens to this man, right? A miraculous thing. And that's exactly what he does. Through the rest of this story, we watch as this guy goes and he tells everyone what Jesus has done for him. And specifically, he tells three groups of people what God has done in his life. And as we read along, we will watch and we will see as not a single person in these three groups of people believes what has happened to this guy. None of them believe him. For one reason or another, all three of these groups, they are unable to see what God has done in this man's life. You see, the ironic thing about this story is that the only person in it who is able to see is the man who was born blind. The Bible's funny sometimes. And with the time we have remaining, if you don't mind, I would love to unpack exactly what is blinding these three groups of people. And my prayer for you is that as we discover what is blinding each of them, that you might discover what is blinding you. John chapter 9, verse 8, the text says this: the neighbors and those who had seen him before, everybody say before, those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some said, "It is he." Others said, "No, but he is like him." The first question I want you all to ask yourselves tonight, and if you're taking notes, you can write this down, but I want everyone to ask themselves this first question. Are you blinded by your past? Has anyone ever tried to tell you who you are because of something you've done? Has anyone ever tried to define you as the person that you used to be in the past? You see, the neighbors here, they are blinded by who this man used to be, right? They say, "Oh, yeah, we know this guy. He's the blind man. He's a bum. He's a fool. He's a beggar." That is how it has always been. And real quick to start out, I want to let you know that just because that's how it's always been in your life, that doesn't mean that's how God intended it to be. You see, some of you, I know your family has always been broken, but that doesn't mean that God didn't create you for reconciliation and that you need to walk in brokenness for the rest of your life. Some of you, you've always been depressed, but that doesn't mean that God didn't create you for joy. Some of you, you've always struggled with this sin. You've always been the one that everyone makes fun of, but just because that's how it's always been in your life does not mean that that is how God intended it to be. Some of us in here tonight, we are blinded by how it's always been, right? We're blinded by the mistakes we've made in the last year, or the lies that we've told, or the friendships that we've broken off in the wrong way. And right now we're sitting here and the guilt of your past is blinding you from seeing God's potential for your future. But it doesn't have to be a bad thing, right? It's not necessarily have to be a bad thing. Actually, it is possible to be blinded by a good thing in your life, I think. I mentioned earlier how I went to this camp. 13 years ago, I came to this camp for the first time, and I remember to this day, I remember where I sat, I remember what I was wearing, I remember everything about that night. On Thursday night of this camp, 13 years ago, God spoke to me in a miraculous way. And that was the night that I gave my heart to Jesus. My life changed, my identity changed forever on that night. It was the most incredible night of my faith journey by far. It was a good thing. Problem was, every year I came back to camp after that, I got real disappointed when God didn't speak to me in the same exact way on the same exact night. I was really let down when I wasn't crying as much as I was the year before. I was really upset when I didn't feel as though God was as life-changing this week as he was last year. But you see, it was the good experience, the good thing God had done in my past was actually blinding me from seeing what God was trying to do in my present. Some of you walked in here with expectations. Some of y'all come into camp every year with expectations. Are you perhaps blinded by your expectations? Because you see, in the Bible, God does not say, "Behold, I am doing the same thing." He don't say that. He doesn't even say, behold, I am doing a bigger or better or more emotional thing. But in his word, God says, behold, I am doing a new